All right.
I don't think you know. Okay, so I don't have to take it. It's a bad day.
All right. Office hours, August 2. I only got 2 questions from you, Jonathan. You got another question?
I mean, maybe it's big of a topic, but like event loop,
Yes, talk about that.
all the good stuff. Talk about that.
V8. Okay. Cool. Do that. I mean, this is pretty philosophical, but we can talk about best practices in maintainable readable code. I mean, okay, let's start with this then. Does anyone else have any other questions they want to get on the list for today? Woot. Okay, bubble, insertion, and other sorting algorithms. The reason these things are in the curriculum is because they're often talked about in interviews, and they're good for you to know. It's good for you to understand complex algorithms, and sorting algorithms are like a good place to get experience dealing with logic problems. Like logic problems that deal with loops are things that a lot of people would never encounter outside of programming. So it's good to like think about how the way you sort an array of stuff can be complicated and have varying different like performance characteristics to them depending on what you do and how much work you do. Whenever you do anything in an iteration, whenever you have like a variable number of things, so we might be sorting an array of 10 things or 1,000,000 things, right? We're going to quickly scale up whatever our solution is, right? We're gonna have to do it 1,000,000 times. Is it gonna be fast, right? So there's a lot of cool visualizations for different sorting algorithms that will show you in a more intuitive visual way, like why bubble sort is less performant than insertion. I actually don't know that that's true, but whatever it is, right? You can kind of visualize like, oh, this one takes way longer to sort, and you can kind of get a sense of why if you watch some of those visualizations. But I wouldn't say that it's super important outside of experience just with algorithms in general, but then also sorting algorithms like bubble sort and other sort of academically discussed solutions to sorting things are talked about in interviews sometimes. So we have it in the phase 1 curriculum so that you have a little experience with it, and you have some experience with just kind of pure algorithmic solution authoring. But then also we'll cover it again in phase 5. You'll do some whiteboarding around it and stuff like that.
Out of curiosity, like when does, I mean, I'm sure this is when you get to the job type thing, but when does it like come into play when you actually have to like say no big O notation in like the deeper sense? I feel like I got an understanding of it, but
sure. So big O notation is going to help you understand like a sort of complexity of your code, right? Like one of the most common things you might run into as a web developer is something called an N+1 query. So if you go to, let's say we go to a web page that is showing us a list of books, right? We got that classic thing we always talk about, like a bookstore, right? So we go to a web page and it shows us 100 books, right? We're talking about Goodreads or something like that, right? So we've got 100 books that we're going to get back from the database because we're paginating at 100 per page, right? And let's say we write our code so that we go get our first page of 100 books, and then for each one of those books we have to go get like its genres or something, right? We could make the mistake, and this is a common mistake, where your first query is get the 100 books, and then you loop through each book, and for each book you do a query to go get its genres, right? So now you're doing what's called an N+1 query, which is N being the 100 books, plus 1 being the initial query to get those books. So you do 1 to get the books, and then you do 100 more queries, right? When you could have done all of that in 2 queries. You could have gotten the books, and then you could have gotten all the genres for all those books if you had crafted your app, if you had programmed your app a little bit differently, right? So that's the kind of thing that we are probably going to run into as a web developer in terms of performance, which is that the logic of your program is just written in an expensive way when there could be a couple of optimizations you could do in there. And it's actually not uncommon for you to do like an n plus, or like an n times 3 or something like that, where like I've got my 100 books, but now I'm getting genres and I'm getting author details and I'm getting price from all these other queries. So now I'm doing like 400 queries just to show you this page, right? So that's something that I've run into a lot, and that I think you'll run into in your first couple of years of web development. I don't think you're going to run into a situation where you've got to sort an array of things and the sorting solution you've written is not fast enough and you need to think about how to make a faster one. Most of the time, the optimizations and the slowdowns that you're going to run into are going to have to do with things like talking to external services. So a database query or an HTTP query that's going off to another machine and coming back. And those can get pretty slow and costly, especially because round trips start to add up, right? Just sending the request and getting the response, regardless of the work it takes to formulate that response from the SQL server, can start to add up. So I've personally, I've been making websites for a long time, and I've never needed to write a complex, mathematically optimized sorting query. Most of the optimization stuff I've done has been reducing the number of times I talk to the DOM in a browser, right? That can be expensive because you're actually leaving JavaScript and going to an external, in a sense, an external resource that is another part of the browser that renders the page, and that bridge can be slow. Again, talking to SQL servers and HTTP requests can be slow. So that's where I've spent most of my time needing to think about optimization. But if I'm like writing some code in JavaScript that runs on either node or in the browser, and I've got an array in memory, how I sort that is generally never going to be slow enough to where I care whether or not bubble sort is faster or more efficient, right? I've never implemented bubble sort as a solution to a problem ever. Now, that doesn't mean that my experience is going to dictate what your experience will be. I'm sure J-Rob has had a case in his career where he needed to write bubble sort. Maybe that's not true, but let's just say it is, right? I think different developers, depending on different tasks, are going to have different requirements, but I personally wouldn't weight these sorting algorithms very high on the sort of things that you need to know for the sake of knowing them, but they're good meta lessons in that, like, they're just good challenges, right? Now I've had a challenge of, I've got an array of complex objects, let's say users or books or complex models of some kind, right? And I need to sort them in some complex ways, right? Like maybe I'm building a single page application where it's a big table view of those books, and I want to click the headers and sort those, and maybe I want to say sort by the book's name, then by the author, then by the year, and you want to do a complex like multi-field join, right? That can get a little challenging just from a coding standpoint, writing the correct sort function algorithm to actually get the complex sorting that you want. That you will run into, but not from I wouldn't worry about it from a performance aspect.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Because never used that. I always wondered. I said, how do you actually get to write that goddamn stuff?
Yeah. I mean, it's much more of a real world situation to say, like, I mean, even in SQL, sorting is we usually do most of our sorting in SQL when we're backing with our data in SQL Server. Like, I wouldn't want to I'd rather the SQL Server sort than I have to sort,
Absolutely.
right? Especially when we're doing pagination, you need it to do it that way, right? Sure. So you might, if you're interested in complex sorting, you might think about how to sort in SQL with sorting across multiple fields, right?
Gotcha.
So
before you would bring it, sort it before you even get the information.
Exactly, and you have to do that because usually you only want like a chunk of that result, right? You want page 1 or page 2, right? Cool. Is that everything you needed on this one?
Yeah.
Cool. Best practices for maintainable and readable code. I mean, I would say when you're writing your code, the number 1 thing is it works. The number 2 thing, it's readable and maintainable. And these probably are in dispute, right?
I'm just kind of wondering more like,
I might even do that.
What is, I mean, even just looking at like, what are your best practices personally? Like, I'm sure there's
Sure. There's a lot of, this is super subjective. Some of the stuff that I can think of off the top of my head is never use short variable names like right? Don't use I for index, use index. If your variable name has to be like, right? If your variable name needs to be something like that, that's great. Like it may seem long, and I think intuitively people see things like this and they're like, ugh, that's such a long thing to have to write. But you never want to optimize for programmer laziness, right? We want to optimize for the maintainability of the code, and that, I think, in my opinion, means that like longer, more specific descriptive names of functions and variables or anything that you can name is going to be easier for you and any other developers who are coming to this code not in an unfresh way. Like maybe you're coming back to this code 6 months later, or somebody's picking up a project from you and they haven't seen this code before. They don't want to have to, if they have to look at a variable and read the code to figure out what that variable is, and they can't infer some meaning just from its name, I think it's a poorly named variable, right? So people will often write functions with variable names like data or thing, you know what I mean? Like, these are equivalently meaningless, right? If you can't take that variable out of context and have some idea of what's going on and how it's intended to be used and what's in there, then I think you should rethink what you're naming those variables. Yeah.
Is there something about how you like the tense of, like do you write things in past tense, like sorted or like?
Oh, I'm not thinking about tense here, right? Like,
I'm just wondering if there's some sort of like something you stick
I mean, honestly, books by author would be fine for that. Although I might think of this as a map instead of an array.
like, would you say concatenate array or concatenated? I don't know, like, you know?
I mean,
So you look
the how we got here, the fact that we sorted, the fact that we concatenated, that's not as much as what I care about, but what is in the thing and what is it intended to be used for.
right, but what I'm wondering is like the name of the variable is like based on the result of what you're gonna do, or the action is.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I usually go for what describes what's in the variable as best as possible, and then if I can also describe what it's intended to be used for, then that would be good too. But that's come second, I think. Yeah.
So kind of like a GitHub, like commit almost, where you have to be, or like it's my understanding that you have to be more declarative type. Would that be something that you would do? Or?
Yeah, I don't know. I actually I've never thought about whether or not tense is involved. But I mean, in commit messages, it makes sense. The difference between like, you know, changes the way the red button works versus red buttons now do this, right? Like that can make sense to me. Like why you would want to say like, instead of saying what this commit does, say like what's true about the world now that you have this commit. Like those are all preferences too. But I actually have never thought about that dichotomy in my variables too much. Yeah. If you can come up with a good example, I'll tell you which one I prefer, but I can't think of a good example.
There's some variables for that. It just should be consistent. Yeah. It seems that it doesn't really matter whether it's past.
Yes,
that's issue, but if it's all messed up.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, what is readable and maintainable? Let's maintainable.
Not to use I, like in a for loop, you shouldn't.
Yeah, call it index.
Why? Be descriptive.
Because it's more descriptive. I mean, it's just like if I see a single letter variable name, I don't assume what it is. And I know that that's a very common pattern. That's actually probably maybe one of the few exceptions, because using I in a for loop is like what is auto-generated by every editor. Like that I wouldn't be confused by, but that's a bad habit, I think. So you'll see a lot of folks who do with jQuery code. They'll do like, you know, go get my, you know, magic button, and then on click, they'll give a function that just takes E or something. Like, why? I don't know. Does that mean error? Does that mean event? Why not just be more clear? Right? Cool. What?
Instead of like, just like the whole optimizing for pressing tab instead of, because like tab kind of auto fills out the name of it, so you don't have to type E.
Oh, sure. Yeah, you can do stuff like that. Sure. Cool. Also, another thing that's nice about giving long and descriptive variable names is they tend to be more globally unique throughout your code base. So you get the extra advantage of when you see some code, you can just search for where that is in your code base if you don't happen to know. Whereas if you're using short variable names that aren't context specific, then you may not get that. That's a slight advantage, but cool. So let's see, clear variable names, consistency. Right, this is something that's really important, especially as new developers come into, you know, your first programming gig, is that you're going to learn preferences and patterns. I'm going to give you my opinion on how things should be formatted and what patterns are. So, but consistency should supersede that. If you're given a task with, you know, within an existing code base, and you go into a file and that file is formatted in some specific way, rather, you should stay consistent with that file. So even if it violates what you think is the correct way to format things or the way you prefer to format things, I think you should stay consistent with what's going on in that file, because it's just worse in all cases, in my opinion, to come into a file and see like two different conflicting precedences for how you should do something. There was another thing I was going to put on here and I forgot what it was. I can't think of anything else off the top of my head, but there's definitely 5 or 6 more things that should go on this list. It'll pop into my head in the middle of something else, I'm sure.
Also wondering, do most professional, but like, should I be trying to use for each and map and all of those instead of a for loop like all the time? So that's
there are times at which you have to choose one over the other, but I mean, we have for each, and I think it's a fine solution, and I think it looks a little cleaner, and it doesn't require a variable like the index variable to be added to the scope that would be accessible by unrelated code, right? Does that make sense, right? So like if we've got books dot for each, you know, if we've got a function that's like print books, and we use a for each, then even if we needed the index inside, right, this is within the scope of this function. So down here, I don't have access to this index variable. Whereas if I did a for loop, this index variable, I'll just leave it as I, is accessible down here for no reason.
not true if you make it let so far.
That may be true. Yeah, if you make it let, it may actually only be inside that block. Yeah, that may be true. Is that what you were going to say too? Yeah. Okay. So in which case, like, I don't know. There's definitely a case in which this manual for loop, where you're specifically saying like what conditions need to be met for this for loop to continue, same as a while loop, I think that's fine. But this certainly immediately is more clear what I'm doing. I don't have to read this complicated triple expression line to make sure that, because there's a couple different ways people do for loops. So like here is another way to do a for loop to go through things. Here is like even different way, right? So this one's interesting because this one sets I to length -1 and then iterates backwards, right? So like I have to parse that, and that's more work than for each. Now, if I want to go backwards, it might be easier to do something like that. That might be more clear and easier to read, right? I think it is.
It's
But
actually more clear.
yeah. So I really like this because it's very expressive, whereas this is very customizable. So they both have their advantages. Yeah. But you will notice, or at least I've noticed in JavaScript code, people tend to do for loops when they could do for each because we didn't always have for each, which is insane. Cool. I'll try to find some more material on this, on what maintain a readable code is. There's usually at most programming environments, you're going to have a style guide that sort of determines what you shouldn't argue about anymore as a development team is really what it's there for, right? Like a classic one is people really like to do this. They'll do they'll do a formatting like this. And they like to horizontally align based on this, and it makes me want to shoot myself. I really hate it, but you'll see folks do that, and maybe it's in the style guide, and maybe you have to do that, but you know, you could also just quit and work somewhere where they format things reasonably. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. Okay, but seriously. Exactly. All right.
I will say though, I actually know someone who got fired because he argued with people over tabs versus spaces too much. So don't be that guy.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It's clearly spaces. Hello. All right. So a quick setup of Babel for Node. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So you have this readable, maintainable, and like with the consistency, clear variable names. Would you also include, like I always think when I think of readable and maintainable, modular files.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Small,
Small single responsibility. Yeah, this is more of a maintainable thing. Small single responsibility pieces, basically. I can't spell.
It's okay. We know.
That's another thing, right? Like if every time you write some code, as soon as you get it to work, this is what I recommend for a workflow. Get something to work, save it. Just commit a commit that just says whip, right? You should be learning the skills to go back and undo those commits and rename them and pull them apart and put them together again, right? You'll eventually learn more and more Git skills to control that stuff. So my flow is hack to where I get something to work and I prove some concepts and some unknowns to myself and I commit that. Then I go through and I refactor things and I decide like, okay, this part, these two things are really doing the same work and I should pull out that work into a utility function that they can both use. So while I'm hacking toward a solution, I'll totally, if I have to do the same thing 3 times for 3 different things, I'll just copy and paste that code and make sure that those 3 things are working. And if they diverge, they diverge, and I've learned something that A and B is the same, but C is a little bit different, right? And I can see that in my very verbose, not dry code. So this is like drying up your code means like go through and find the repetition and refactor it so that you've got some small single responsibility pieces, right? And they should be well named. And sometimes even just taking a piece of code that you're not going to change at all, it's like in the middle of your function, pulling it out into its own function and giving it a name just for the sake of calling a function that says a clear action can clarify your code a lot and make it more maintainable, right? So some of that too, yeah. So a refactor and dry up your code. Cool. Sweet. So a simple example of how to use Babel. So Babel is a transpiler that will transpile JavaScript code with additional features down to JavaScript code that does not necessarily have those features. So this is this touches on like ECMAScript, different versions of ECMAScript. So like ES5 is the version that sort of works everywhere. ES6 is sort of a pile of features that may or may not be implemented in different environments. So different browsers, different versions of Node may or may not implement different features. So in Node by itself, some of these features exist, right? We can say let in Node. We can do decomposition or deconstruction in Node. And a bunch of these features that are newer to the language have been implemented in later versions of Node. So a lot of the stuff that you might think you need Babel for, like arrow functions or something, you don't need them in later versions of Node. You don't even need them in a lot of newer versions of browsers, right? But if you find out that your code needs to be executed in an environment that doesn't have an ES feature that you want, then it might be appropriate to use Babel. So setting up Babel is, I always just look on their website and I look at what their recommended setup is for Node. You can see that they have a lot of different ways to use Babel to transpile code. I'm going to show you how to do it with inside of a Node package, but there's other ways to do it. So let's do it this way to show an example. Cool. So we're going to install Babel preset, but I think we need Babel too. Babel core. And then we need a Babel RC file. And so this is what our stuff looks like. And just put this preset. So presets are different. I think the way Babel works is there's sort of a Babel, I don't know the hierarchy, but let's look, because they have multiple plugins. Yeah, so they have a bunch of different versions. So ENV replaces 2015, 16, and 17 and latest. So I think this is the latest, even though it's not called latest. Replacing something called latest is a little crazy. But so we're putting in this preset. There are other presets. I think if we were using React, which means we want JSX transpiling, we can add that in there. But for now, we'll just go with like their basic initial setup. And then we should have the Babel command. Oh, we need Babel CLI to do that. So if we look at the stuff we've installed, oh, that's the package lock. I don't want that. Oh, I forgot to npm init. Oops. I forgot to generate a dependency.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I've been seeing in a few people's repos around here the package lock, and I know that like there's a yarn lock file when I use yarn. Is this package lock a new feature? Did npm update?
Yeah.
Okay.
The newer versions of npm have their own lock file, and they're meant to just yarn should not be necessary anymore, according to the npm people, as far as I know.
Yeah.
Could be wrong about that, but I think yarn sort of made their point, and npm was like, fine, we'll do this thing that you're doing, and then now it's just built.
Okay, great, thanks.
So you do want to check the package lock file into your Git repository. Yes.
You didn't do npm init, and so like, where did all those files go?
So I forgot to do npm init. So they still installed into the node modules. If you don't have an npm, if you don't do npm init and you don't have a package JSON, it's still going to install things in your node modules. You can still require them. It just doesn't store them in a package JSON. But I did npm init, and it like figured it out. It looked at my package lock and was like, oh, you have these dependencies. So it's okay. Funny, yeah, okay. So now that we have Babel RC and we've got the Babel CLI, I want this as a normal dependency, and I want the CLI as a div dependency. I think that's the right way to do it. And I'm just going to do npm install again just to make sure that I didn't mess up this formatting. Cool. So we've got these two things because we're going to need them, and then this we only need in development. So this gives us access to the node modules .bin Babel command. Cool. And so we can just say files. So there's a way for you to say, so I can actually do just Babel, and it should work to that. Great, Babel -- help. Cool, cool. So when you're doing transpiling, it would be very unfortunate if you didn't keep your source files separate from your bundled files or your generated files, right? So what we're going to do is make a source directory, and we're going to make a build directory, and then we're going to put the build directory inside of our ignore file. So I've just put this inside of git ignore. And that means anything inside the build directory is not going to get checked in to Git. We're only going to check in our source files, and then whenever we build, those files will be local, and if we go to another machine and check out this repo, we'll build again.
Is build in this case the same as sometimes I see a dist?
Dist would be another one, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Dist is short for like,
Distribution.
I think it's distribution, and I think it just means it's generally like when you're building when you're building like a single package, like we're building, we're gonna build our application and zip it up, and now here's your download for the latest version of our application, right? That's like, we're gonna distribute this new zip file to everyone, and that's the latest thing.
Okay.
That's what I've seen dist used for. We're probably gonna distribute this to our web servers or whatever. So build and dist, I think, are interchangeable. Yeah.
Thank you.
Source is pretty consistent though.
Yes.
Cool. So in our source file, let's just do like, I don't know, add.js, and we'll do subtract.js. Cool. So let's use some. We'll use some ES6 features in here. We'll say const add equals an arrow function that takes A and B, and we won't use curly braces, and we'll just say A plus B, and then we'll say exports default, and I think that'll work. Or that's some nice ES6 over there, ES 2016 or whatever. So then we'll say Babel source, and I'm going to do dash dash help because I don't remember how you say what the dist directory is. I'll get to that error in a minute. Here we go. Outdir is dash D. So we'll do Babel source dash D dist. Or no, sorry, build. And so we got this error. So we actually have to say, I'm just going to get rid of that. I think this will work. Great. So it went through the source directory and it made versions. It compiled them and transpiled them rather, and put versions of them in the build directory. Did you see how that happened? Do you see the output here?
Yeah.
Cool. So now if we look at our add next to our built add, it looks like this. Any questions about this this new version of our code here?
This is a comment. I always feel like Babel. I haven't set up Babel in a while, but I always feel like it's so difficult to set up. But
So, I mean, our setup right now is we just go into our package JSON file and we put a script in here called build, and we just put that command we did right here. And now anytime we want, we can say npm run build, and it'll build our code. So if I come in here and I change this to be some crazy version of add, and I can just run build, and now my ad has been updated.
would you ever want to, like when I run npm start, build first, so I like update the start script to include?
That's a complicated question that it has to do with like how you're deploying and what you want start to mean, and it's very optional. But I wouldn't put the build as part of the start. But maybe if you, depending on the environment, that might be appropriate. But generally, you want to build way before you end up starting. So, but there's all kind. We'd have to talk about specific environments at that point. Cool. So you, so another thing you can do with Babel is you can say dash watch. So this command we ran before, Babel takes a dash dash watch command, right? And so I took this command and I made it what npm run build does. And so if you say npm run build and you give it a dash dash like that, just an empty dash dash, everything after that will be flags and options passed into the command itself, so we can add dash dash watch there. And so we're effectively running this command, effectively running this command by running this command. And you can see that right here. It put quotes around. So now, anytime I make a change, it just detects that that change was made, and you can see I'm auto-updating my source files. And that's what Babel does. I find that the latest versions of Node have enough of the new hot features of JavaScript for me that I don't really need to use Babel. Now, if I'm the time I still would use Babel is if I wanted to make sure I had maximum compatibility across browsers, and older versions of browsers don't support a lot of these things like arrow functions and stuff. So I want them converted back down to ES5. And so I would use Babel transpilation, and when I was building my files with something, building my assets with something like Webpack for the browser. Is that enough?
Yeah. Export default, just real quick. Export default exports it to the basically the ES6 module.
Nope. Well, okay, so yeah, let's talk about this, right? So normally in a file, we would say module.exports equals this thing, and that would be just the one thing we're exporting from this file, right? And then in our other file, we would say, we'd say var add equals require add, or wherever add was, right? So this thing exports one function called add, and or one object. It doesn't have to be a function. So files in Node with the standard require and export are built to export one thing, right? So your exports object can be set to whatever you want. This is an alias for, well, rather, by default, when these files start, they basically start like this. So what you have when you start out, this happens kind of behind the scenes up here, is that you've got a variable called exports, and then you have a variable called module, which has a property called exports that link to the same object. This is the one that matters, module.exports. But the reason why they set up a default like this is because if you want to export more than one thing from a file in Node, you can just write your code like this: exports.add equals whatever you want, and then maybe if we wanted to smash them all in here like this, you could start exporting multiple things, right? But then on the other side, you can't use this syntax anymore. You'd have to go something like this. Or you could use destructuring. Is that what it's called? Destruction? Anyway, doesn't make any sense. But you could do this, where you say, get the object that, the add is now kind of a terrible file name for this, but get the object that was exported, this exports object, this object here, and take the add and subtract properties off and put them in the local variables add and subtract. So we use a single object as an export to curry exporting multiple things, right? So now, that's what you can do in Node just with require and module exports. But what we do in ES6 is we do this, right? We do export, we can export things. We can say const add and const subtract are here, and we can say export add and export subtract, and that's why I did it. And that will export named exports, right? So over here, when we're using ES6 to import, we would say import add from, again, add is a terrible file name now for this, but you would do something like this, or maybe you would do import add and subtract from. It's just a different syntax, right? But the difference being, one of the main difference is, and why this file was, why are you upset about that? Maybe I'm wrong. I know, right? Looks right to me too. Unexpected token add. Because you can do this, Oh, I think you have to do this. Yeah, okay, cool. So you can see down here in my compiled file, it just put add and subtract on the exports object, right? But if you export a default thing, right? So now add is just called default. So on the other side, you can just say import add from add, and that'll get the default. Whereas this will get the named things. Does that make sense? It's just like we had this old system where you were meant to export one thing, but you could export multiple things by exporting an object that had multiple things on it, right? And then they decided, well, we really want to be able to import and export multiple things from files in Node or in JavaScript. So they added this alternate syntax that kind of is backwards compatible to this old syntax. And they do that by, and then the new concept that is being added here is that you always export an object. You never export one thing, but if you are but you have this thing, you have this option of exporting a default thing. It's a bit of a shift. You can read more about it on Babel's website. They'll probably explain it better than I can, but that's essentially what you're seeing here. Is that the default export in Babel? Ugh, what did I do? Oh yeah, I can't do this stuff. Cool. So is that enough?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. All right. Just the JavaScript event loop. This thing is actually a little tricky. I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of how it works. I don't feel like I have a great understanding of how it works, but I never gets in my way. I think I understand enough about it. But I encourage you to look up some of the videos that have been posted in Slack about it. Just do that. There's that tool in Slack where you can search for links people have posted before. There's just stuff about like the JavaScript event loop. There's some people who've done some really good videos on describing how this stuff works. I've watched this one before. This one's really good. And it just goes into a lot of detail. I don't think I could do a better job, especially not in like 10 minutes. So is that good enough to talk about? We can talk about call stacks. I can give you a good quick description of call stacks. But the event loop is a pretty different way of programming language, different from any other programming language I've worked on, where you can kind of implicitly keep the program running without explicitly writing like a for loop or an infinite loop or something like that. There are event-based solutions in other languages, but they generally are done with libraries that ultimately just keep an infinite loop running and then they create their own sort of event loop, whereas it's built in and native to JavaScript. Yeah.
So I've been like looking into the event loop and just like reading Node documentation. And like what keeps coming up, and I feel like this is maybe a computer science thing that I have to is that JavaScript is single-threaded. Right?
Yes.
And so that's why we need the event loops that we can run. So we don't have any blocking. So we have the ability to not block like functions that we need to run.
Yes.
So do you know any examples of like multi-threaded language and what the difference would be in how
sure. So if we were writing a Ruby, I can try to give you a high level. If we were writing a Ruby script, we can do something like this to try to get a little performance. We can make, I don't know that this is going to work, but we can make, so let's say we have a complicated function that's like, do stuff, and inside of this function we're going to do like a file.read of a couple of files, and let's say these are going to be different depending on what you passed in. So we'll do something like this, right? So let's say we've got this method that takes a variable, and then based on that variable it's going to go read a couple of files, right? So now this reading files is a blocking operation. We have to ask the file system to go get that information, and we have to wait until it comes back, and that takes time. The disk has to like go get it, right? So let's say we wanted to do this for like a bunch of different things, right? So if we do it like this, the way it works in Ruby is we just sit here and we wait. and then we sit here and we wait, and then we sit here and we wait. We do that for Steve, and then we do here, and it's just like we wait. It's like single threaded, right? So one way we can do this is we can create new threads, and at least this is the way that it works in Ruby, is we can create a couple new threads, and Ruby has what's called green threads, which means there isn't more than one thing happening at the same time. It still is one thing's happening at one time, but we can take advantage of the fact that one thread is blocked so another thread can execute. So what's going to happen now is we're going to hit this, and we're going to wait for the content of A to come back, and then this thread's going to take over while the first thread is sleeping, and it's going to access its first file and wait, and then it's going to go to sleep, and then this thread is going to get to pick up. And there's all this complicated stuff built into Ruby to look at all these threads that are going on and figure out, okay, this one's blocked and this one could go, but we're still waiting for this thread which isn't blocked, and it's managing like what's the most efficient way for me to like let this thread go, and then when it stops, go to this thread, and kind of juggle around taking these parallel separate jobs and really kind of doing one step at a time in a single thread. So you get sort of multi-threaded behavior, but you still only have one thing happening at the same time. There are other languages that do take advantage of the fact that hardware has multiple processors, and so there could actually be two things being executed by two processors at the same time. And that's actually much more complicated to reason about, because if one process is trying to manipulate memory and another process is trying to manipulate that same memory, you can mess each other up, right? So now you have to code all these things like blocking, like I have temporary lock on this folder memory, so it blocks this other process, and then you can deadlock where like both things are waiting. It's like, it gets real complicated. So Ruby avoids all that by only doing one thing at a time, but you still get this way of coding where you can say, do these 5 completely separate flows of code, but let Ruby the language figure out, do the first part here, then the second part here, and the fourth part here, and kind of jump around, right?
Okay.
So is like parallelism different from concurrency, or is it the same thing?
That's a good question. Parallelism, different concurrency.
You have to be aware of some of this stuff in like Go, right? Like, 'cause I think when I was doing the Go tutorial, like they talked about like blocking and.
Yeah, but Go is more like a concurrent language.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I honestly don't know how to answer that question.
Yeah, I'll look it up.
Yeah.
I just always curious to know like.
Sure. I don't know those terms academically enough to like give you a good example of why they might be different. They sound the same to me, but I would want to, if I heard that word when I was reading some documentation about a language, I would definitely want to dig in and see what they specifically meant.
All right.
So is there a way of like making these callbacks in Ruby the way that we do in JavaScript, or this is how one might handle?
So you generally don't. I mean, there are libraries within Ruby that do give you a DSL, a domain-specific language, for doing asynchronous code, where you can say, go spawn a new thread, and in that thread do an HTTP request, and when it's done, come back to this thread and tell it to run this function. There's ways to do that in Ruby, but it's not sort of the standard way to do it, where it is the standard way to do it in JavaScript.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Cool. Any other questions about this stuff? Okay.
I have a quick question.
Oh, sure.
Earlier, when you install modules globally, like npm install-g,
Sure.
where do they go?
Oh, that's a good question. So let's see. Do I have NodeMon installed? No. And if I do a witch on it, it'll say it can't find it, right? So now if I do npm install globally NodeMon, I don't know where they go, but I can tell you where they go by using the witch command, which tells you where commands live, right? So when this installs, I'll do witch NodeMon again, and it'll tell me at least where the file that it's calling, that it's executing, lives. Now that might symlink to somewhere else, but we can find that out too. So which NodeMon? So it lives in my home directory, in my NVM directory, because I use something called Node Version Manager, which means I've got many versions of Node installed, so we can look in this directory here and see I've got 4 versions of Node installed. So it's going to depend on which version of Node this specific terminal is configured to use. That's how NVM works. But aside from that complexity, let's just say I had one version of Node. It's in the sort of system place where Node lives, as opposed to the project directory, right? And so if we want to see what I have installed globally, I can probably look in this folder and see in lib maybe, lib node modules. These are the ones I have installed globally. And then there's also just a bin directory. So these are, like I thought, symlinks. So I've got these NPM packages installed. So I've got HTTP server installed globally, which is actually in the node module, the global node modules directory, but it got symlinked into this node modules bin directory, which is in my path. It's actually the very first thing in my path. And that's because NVM, when I switch node versions, it modifies my path to a different version of node.
How do you get it to show the syncs?
My LL is is L-L, which my L, so it's really LS TBH1L. So what?
LS-L will suffice.
Yeah, LS-L will totally do it. Yeah, the normal one is LS, and then LSLA will show you like all files in a list format. Yeah, I don't know what TBH1 does, but there you go. Cool. All right, I think that's time, or it's a little early. We have time for one more question if someone has something. What is the key to life? I believe the answer to that is 42.
Is that right?
That was gonna be my answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
The slow clap.